In 1890, in the settlement of Cheyenne, Oklahoma, a young woman carried out her daily tasks among corrals and dirt roads. During that Old West period, the community lived off livestock farming and small general stores. The first rail lines were beginning to reduce rural isolation. In 1888, an itinerant photographer captured Lily Mae Smith Tucker, a descendant of the Cherokee Nation and daughter of Nimrod Jarrett Smith, a community figure in the Indian Territory. The glass plate, produced with the wet collodion technique, reveals her features and hints of a culture in transition under Western influences. Marcia Paschal descends from Lieutenant Colonel George W. Paschal and Cherokee forebears, blending a 19th century military tradition with her indigenous heritage. While the officers' deeds were recorded in campaign reports and official decorations, Cherokee culture appears in ceremonies, language, and oral narratives that Marcia researches through genealogical archives and tribal records. In 1898, photographer Frank Reinhardt captured Hattie Tom, a woman of the Chiricahua Apache tribe, during the Indian Congress in Omaha. The photograph documents not only her face and traditional clothing, beaded necklaces and a fringed leather outfit, but also suggests ceremonial practices and communal bonds within this group. This visual record enriches the study of Chiricahua social structures, rituals, and cultural exchanges at the end of the 19th century. Dated to around 1890, this photograph of a young Lakota woman records a moment of cultural transition on the Great Plains. She appears wearing traditional ornaments and garments, while background details suggest changes imposed by outside contact. This visual document illustrates ritual practices, ways of life, and everyday artifacts, providing material for historical studies of her group's heritage and social relations. Sawatanuk, born in the late 19th century, was living in 1914 as an active member of the Kwakwaka'wakw on the northwest coast of Vancouver. Her community inhabited cedar communal houses and organized itself around the salmon fishing and deer hunting seasons. She took part in potlatches that governed exchanges, alliances, and social offices. Her daily life followed ancestral traditions passed down orally. This photograph portrays a young woman of undocumented identity and origins, positioned before bowls whose purpose remains unknown. Made by photographer Adam Clark Vroman around 1860, the image uses the platinum print process, prized at the time for its stability and tonal range, and reflects 19th century documentary practices. Around 1900, a young member of one of the many Native American tribes was documented in a studio photograph. This early 20th century visual record reveals not only her face, but also suggests aspects of traditional dress, daily practices, and the social dynamics of her indigenous community. Innusk, grandson of the Kickapoo leader who mediated relations with other tribes, begins to appear in oral accounts recorded in the late 1880s. His presence symbolizes the transmission of rituals, ceremonial practices, and the internal council's decisions of the Kickapoo tribe. Thus, Innusk plays a decisive role in preserving historical heritage and consolidating the collective identity of this indigenous people. Julie Nelson was born in 1886 on land belonging to her indigenous nation, characterized by plains and waterways. She belonged to a community guided by tribal leaders and seasonal ceremonies. Like her compatriots, she was dedicated to hunting, cultivation, and the oral preservation of knowledge about the land. Alice was born around 1900 in territory that today corresponds to the northwestern United States. Official records are scarce and oral traditions do not specify her tribal origin, but they indicate a possible link with the Cayuse, Walla Walla, or Umatilla nations. This uncertainty in the documents suggests that her practices and family ties derive from one of these indigenous communities of the region. In 1900, Apache women regarded basketry as a cornerstone of their material culture. They used grass straw, reeds, sweetgrass, and cedar strips, preparing and dyeing them with oils extracted from seeds. Each basket, whether for storage or ceremonies, was woven in geometric and symbolic patterns, the result of techniques and knowledge passed down through generations, demonstrating the central role of weaving in community life. In 1910, the depiction of an Arapaho woman documents the continued presence of this tribe on the Great Plains of North America. Wearing a leather dress adorned with geometric patterns and beads, signs of affiliation and status, she illustrated ceremonial practices and the transmission of traditional knowledge in a context of political change. Minnie Lou Ottinger Bradley emerges at the beginning of the 20th century amid profound transformations in the United States. She witnessed rapid industrial expansion, the women's suffrage movement, labor organization, and the debates over prohibition. Her testimony offers a detailed view of the social, political, and cultural changes of that turning point. In 1909, in White Cloud, Kansas, a photograph captures Nora Barada Murphy, an Iowa woman then residing in that community. The daughter of generations whose presence stretches across Kansas and Nebraska since the 19th century, she appears in traditional attire, beaded necklaces, leather fringes, and printed fabrics. The portrait documents not only her clothing but also the marks of her cultural identity, visible in her features and bearing. The 1923 photograph of Ada Lopez Richards documents daily life among the Tolowa in the early 20th century. From the coastal villages between California and southern Oregon, Ada was instrumental in collecting songs and oral narratives, as well as teaching the traditional basketry techniques that sustained her community. In 1910, Anna Cask Cash conveyed Cayuse tradition to observers by wearing her ceremonial attire, assembled with skins, glass beads, leather fringes, and scraps of commercial cotton, that reflected agricultural cycles and rites maintained by the tribe since time immemorial. At that time, these practices faced pressure from assimilation policies and the rapid spread of Western values and customs. Dated 1908, the photograph documents a young woman of the Sioux tribe, a Native American people of the Great Plains. Captured on a glass plate, she wears bison hides, feather adornments, and rows of glass beads. The image serves as a record of Sioux identity practices at the start of the 20th century. In the autumn of 1939, during a federal government ethnographic survey, a photographer captured June Welch, a 16-year-old Cherokee girl in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Her cotton dress and beaded necklace reproduced patterns handed down for generations. The photograph documents ritual practices and collective memories. In 1886, Lena Geronimo was born within the walls of Fort Marion, today called Castillo de San Marcos, on the Florida coast, where her father, the Apache chief Geronimo, was held as a prisoner of war by the United States Army. This context of captivity marks the beginning of her life and imbues her trajectory with profound historical symbolism. In 1910, a young Kiowa woman experienced the practices and traditions of her people. Kiowa communities occupied the Great Plains in nomadic bands. Among their tasks, young people gathered roots and fruits, crafted pouches and leather utensils, and cared for children, ensuring the transmission of knowledge and rituals. Josefa Rios, born in the community of Sells in Tohono O'odham territory, devoted herself in the 1920s to the oral documentation of traditional myths and songs, the organization of annual cultural learning gatherings, and the teaching of craft techniques. She acted as an interlocutor between elders and researchers, recording ceremonial practices and ensuring the continuity of her people's knowledge amid social transformations. In 1892, a young Kiowa woman living on the southern Kansas reservation wore traditional ceremonial attire with beads and leather fringes, evidencing the persistence of her people's rituals and cultural symbols. Juanita Buck, a member of the Dakota Sioux Nation established along the Minnesota River, distinguished herself in the 1880s by preserving traditional rituals, passing oral narratives to new generations, and adapting ancestral practices in the face of federal authorities' impositions. In 1910, the photographic record of Goldie Jamison Conklin, a member of the Seneca Nation on the Allegheny Reservation, shows her wearing her ceremonial clothing, an embroidered tunic, beaded necklace, and feather ornaments, elements that reflect her people's rights, tribal affiliation, and traditions. A photograph shows a member of the Umatilla tribe, identified as a hereditary princess, during a ceremony on the banks of the Columbia River in northeastern Oregon. Major Lee Morehouse captured this scene in August 1900 during his studies of local indigenous communities. The chief's daughter presents Latiquilla Tede, a young woman from the Pueblo community of New Mexico, photographed in 1905 by Carl Moon during his ethnographic expedition to the American Southwest. The image records ceremonial garments and a reserved posture, reflecting ancestral practices and serving as a document of early 20th century indigenous cultural exchange. In 1910, a young woman of the Kalispel tribe called Pend d'Oreille by colonizers illustrates an indigenous community that, since before the treaties of 1855, lived along the Pend d'Oreille and Spokane rivers, sustaining itself with salmon fishing and root gathering in territories now located in northern Idaho and eastern Washington. The photograph, dated approximately 1904, records a woman of the Navajo Nation in the American Southwest. Her serene expression and slight smile, spontaneous and unposed, highlight the cultural stance and symbolic value attributed to indigenous representation at that time, giving the image an essential documentary role for ethnographic studies. In 1899, Seattle welcomed LaRoche, a young man of the Yakama Nation recognized for his participation in public ceremonies and display of traditional crafts. The son of tribal elders, he acted at civic meetings as an intermediary between settlers and Yakama, consolidating his influence in local society. A 1908 photograph captures Awe Ayu, whose name means pretty flower in Seneca, a member of the Seneca Nation, wearing ceremonial clothing. The portrait documents ritual practices and symbols of Seneca belonging in the early 20th century. Kau Utiz, a member of the Caddo Nation, was photographed by George Bancroft in 1906. The image documents ceremonial ornaments and ancestral symbols, evidencing ritual practices and the social organization of Caddo communities on the southeastern plains of the United States. During the 1907 expedition to document indigenous cultures, Edward S. Curtis photographed Lucille of the Dakota Sioux ethnicity. She wears ceremonial attire composed of mantles and bead necklaces, as well as bracelets, and her expression reflects the passage of ancestral knowledge. In 1894, a photograph captures a smiling Kiowa woman, a document that illuminates social practices and everyday objects of this community. Taken on indigenous territory, the image details her hairstyle and clothing, providing a basis for studies of Kiowa social structures and cultural transmission at the end of the 19th century. The 1905 photograph records Kate Thunder Miner, a member of the Ho-Chunk tribe in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. Standing before a simple board backdrop, she wears a checked wool shawl with fringes, reflecting both indigenous textile techniques and the regional influences of the time. In 1898, a glass plate recorded the portrait of a young man of the Assiniboine tribe during an expedition to the northern plains. The photograph reveals facial features, ceremonial clothing, and traditional adornments, offering a valuable visual document about their rituals and social organization. Zitkalasa, known in Lakota as Redbird, stood out in the early 20th century as a writer and advocate for indigenous rights. In autobiographies and articles in English-language newspapers, she exposed Lakota traditions and criticized assimilation policies, opening space for Native American narratives. Around 1900, a photograph records a woman of the Crow tribe near Sheridan, Wyoming. She wears ceremonial attire consisting of an elk-tooth tiara, a worked leather belt, and several bead necklaces. The image documents social practices and Crow cultural identity. Atra Ason, officially known as Bertha Thompson, was born at the start of the 20th century, the daughter of Milton James Thompson, a jurist of European descent, and Chinawa, a member of the Yurok tribe. Her name appeared in 1914 civil records in California, a document that attests not only to her family origin, but also to the systematic effort to catalog indigenous lineages at the time, demonstrating the historical value of such records for reconstructing ancestral narratives. In 1880, Julia Ann Keka, a member of the Umatilla tribe, was photographed in an official ethnographic session conducted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The image documents her braids, typical adornments, and clothing, reflecting the coastal traditions of the Columbia River and the changes imposed by resettlement policies of that period. On a 1900 glass plate, photographed by an anonymous author, appears an unidentified Native American young woman. Wearing mantles and ceremonial accessories of her tribe, she reveals the persistence of ancestral customs amid the cultural assimilation policies of the time.